Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast. Conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now, here are your hosts, Ed Stetzer and Daniel Yang.
Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name is Daniel Yang, the director of the Church Multiplication Institute, and today we're talking with Dr. Travis Dickinson. Travis is professor of philosophy at Dallas Baptist University and a regular contributor for the Christian Research Journal. He's the author of several books, including Logic in the Way of Jesus, Thinking Critically and Christianly. His latest is Wandering Toward God, Finding Faith Amid Doubts and Big Questions, which was chosen by Outreach Magazine as the 2023 Apologetics Resource of the Year. But before we talk to Travis, we want to remind you that if you're enjoying our interviews, it would help us if you left us a review. Now let's go to Ed Stetzer, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and the incoming dean at the Talbot School of Theology.
Well, you just heard the amazing voice of Daniel Yang, who is actually not here today. He's out preaching or teaching at some important thing, and so when you next time you fill out, some of you have been doing those reviews, and we're super thankful for those. Always do a review where you get your podcast. But one of you left the thing that you really love about the podcast is Daniel Yang. And so just keep dropping those in there, but maybe notice that he's not here this time. Anyway, okay, you've already heard our guest introduced. Super to have this conversation. Travis, so glad to be with you. Tell us a little bit to start about your own background with Christianity and when you first ever questioned your faith, and maybe kind of walk through some of the personal things that led to this book.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Ed. I really appreciate it, and team. I grew up in a very Christian setting, so about as Christian as it could possibly be. My folks were both in the ministry, and it was a ministry started by my great-great-grandfather. So
wow.
It's kind of that legacy bit there that definitely features or figures in for me. We were in church anytime the doors were open, grew up going to Sunday school, youth group, you name it, camps, retreats, mission trips, even international mission trips, and kind of did that whole process without actually asking, why should I believe? And so there was this really particular moment in seminary, actually, which is not a completely uncommon thing for seminarians to question and doubt their faith, but was sitting in a classroom, and it just hit me. I just realized it was a class on world religions, and I think what I felt was that we were giving Christianity a pass, as we can sometimes do in the church and in even in seminary, where we were hypercritical of other religious traditions, and yet the Christian tradition was sort of getting a pass, I felt like. And so, but what it stirred in my heart, I think, was that I'm the one giving Christianity a pass, and I've done it my whole life. And so one thing that I think is important to mention is that I sincerely believed. It wasn't that I realized I didn't really believe. It was that I did believe, but my reasons for believing was what kind of got thrown into questioning and that sort of thing, and realized that I think I kind of just believed because, my growing up experience, it was my parents wanted me to, and my grandparents wanted me to, and the ministry, that whole thing. I sincerely believed, but I didn't believe because I had found it to be true. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. And so for me, I had to lean in because I didn't know these other traditions or even atheism or even agnosticism was true either. I had to lean in. And so my story, and really the reason for the book, is that I found a lot of answers. I found a lot of truth. Not to say I've got it all figured out. I'm always quick to say that I'm still in process. I'm still on the journey. And I think I'm comfortable there. It can be uncomfortable, but I'm overall comfortable with that sort of in process place. But what I found in that time is that I found truth, and it caused my faith to grow. And that's kind of the irony, is that the very thing that I think we're scared of when it comes to doubts and questions, my leaning in led me to truth and a greater faith.
Love it. And the book, to remind everyone, is Wandering Toward God, Finding Faith Amid Doubts and Big Questions. Okay, so you have this epiphany where you kind of explore some of these things. And I do think it's really worth noting that, I just preached Sunday at the time of this recording. This Sunday before we recorded this, I preached at my own church from 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah.
And I talked about, there are times when I have just, probably in hard times, I've like doubted, Lord, is this all real?
Yeah.
And the example I gave Sunday was, you got to explore what are the religions. I use the example of Mormonism and Islam, where basically, in both cases, angels visit these prophetic leaders, one in a cave, one in upstate New York, and basically give these private revelation that then spreads around the world, and millions upon millions people would believe. Yet Christianity makes quite a different claim. 1 Corinthians 15. Quite a different claim. The word appeared is used 4 times over this short description that Paul gives, including to 500 people, where Paul basically says, and they're still alive, go check out their house. They're living at Main Street. You can go knock on the door. So Christianity seems uniquely and unapologetically, hey, there's evidence that's here. You don't have to believe just one person. So talk to us a little bit about why Christianity is framed that way, compared to other religions of faith. Why does that matter?
Yeah, and that was a big piece for me. I mean, that's interesting that you say that, because I think for me it was also 1 Corinthians 15 where I saw Paul just sort of lay the whole thing out as if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain. So that it really turns on the historicity of that event. Right. And you just don't see that in other religious traditions. That was a big
not just historicity, but they're alive. Go talk to them. Go down the street. I'm fascinated by that. That to me, I said Sunday, this to me is the passage I go to when I've had doubts.
That's right.
But anyway, there's more, but keep going.
Yeah. And so for me in, this journey, in this moment, I really dove into the other religious traditions too, and was trying to find, okay, where are their sort of equivalent to our apologetics departments, and that kind of a thing. And honestly, couldn't really find them. I mean, not to say they're non-existent in all other religious traditions, but it is completely absent, it seems to me, in some religious traditions. Some of the more Eastern traditions aren't even trying to sort of say that this is true and based on historical events. It's just not a way in which they approach those matters. And so, yeah, I think that's the way I sort of think of the gospel in a way, is to say, you should believe because this is true. Does it have all kinds of other benefits, and might there be other social pressures? Might my parents and others be really happy? Yeah, those things are all there too, of course. And I think it does lead to human flourishing, and we can get into all that too. But I think ultimately it boils down to, you just think of Paul. Paul is claiming you should believe because this is true, and here's the reasons why, and here's evidence to think that. Now, I think one way that people get a little, sort of pause on this is because they feel like it becomes overly academic, and that's one of the big things that I like to remind ourselves, is that this need not be. I mean, are there tremendous resources out there that can, just exercise the brightest bulbs out there? I think so. But there's also really accessible stuff. And the thing that we always have to keep in mind is that the pursuit here is the pursuit of a person. It's not a pursuit of a system or a doctrine or even an intellectual belief. It's the pursuit of God. And so I take it when Jesus says the most important thing for us to do, the greatest commandment, is to love God with all of who we are. And he includes in that the mind. But it's not only an intellectual pursuit. I just think that's a really important part of the journey.
Yeah, and I think it's really essential that we lean in on issues of doubt. And I think, our audience is, of course, pastors and church leaders. And even like when I preach my sermon, I told people that there are times I have doubted. And again, I mentioned I go to this passage and others. But there's almost a sense that as a pastor and a church leader, I tend to be pretty transparent when I teach and preach. As a pastor and church leader, you're supposed to kind of allay people's doubts, to address people's doubts, not kind of identify with their doubts. So talk to us a little bit about how you would encourage, you're an elder in your local church, how would you encourage church leaders, pastors and church leaders to walk through those doubts? What would that journey look like?
So I think that, one of the things I say in the book is that our churches don't tend to be a safe place for people to doubt their faith. And I think that one of the primary things that I think pastors and church leaders need to do is really cultivate a culture. Now, we got to be careful too, because I think there are various ones out there, these sort of hipster online sort of figures who are sort of celebrating doubt and pushing deconstruction even, as if doubt is the place to end, like it's an end in itself. So my catchphrase is that doubt is not the destination, right? It's not where we want to end up. And so what I really think a pastor needs to do, though, is cultivate a culture where it's a safe place to. I mean, my goodness, it's like if you're doubting your faith, wouldn't we want people to come to the church in order to find their answers rather than Google or some other source like that? And so I think that takes a lot of intentionality. I think that the pastor, as you said, Ed, that you're pretty authentic and transparent. I think that's crucial for a pastor to make reference to the fact that he has, walked this journey too and struggled here and there. Again, I don't think we have to sort of always lay out our dirty laundry, but at least sort of talk about the wins and talk about the fact that like this was an important role for me or important moment for me or whatever. I think a lot of the church setting and the home setting have a lot of parallels, of course, and so we do this. I always say like my purpose in a lot of this material is, of course, for the church and of course for the world, but it's, I've got 4 kids myself who are teenagers and preteens, so they're really just on the journey. Like if you're a kid, you're on the journey in that way. And so I don't want my kids to doubt their faith, but I kind of do. I kind of want them to go through those times where they're struggling a little bit. Like, I don't know how to think of this, and I want to cultivate a sort of culture in my home where they feel comfortable to say, I don't understand this. I don't know how to put these two things together, or I heard this and that out there. I would much rather that than and them struggle through it and sort of doubt their faith a little bit than them be in a biology class somewhere on a state campus and just be in the throes of it with with me, absent and not in our home. And so anyway, I think it's a very good thing, so long as we don't make that the destination, that's the end. This is opportunity for us to lean in and ask those difficult questions and love God with our minds. And so the pastor, I think, needs to cultivate that, be authentic, be transparent, and just provide ways. It's not as easy as you might think to really provide, sort of cultivate that culture. But I think in small group settings and mentorship settings and just ringing that bell often that, hey, if you have questions, if you're on that journey and you don't have it all figured out, guess what? I don't either. So, let's talk. I think just cultivating that kind of culture at the church is just crucial.
Okay, so let's talk about what that looks like. Partly it's going to be transparency from pastors and church leaders. So when he or she gets up and says, I've doubted, here's where I walk through that. In a sense, and this is part that people can see in wandering toward God, even your own story is honest and transparency, which I think encourages others towards honesty and transparency. You don't want people to think that they have to question alone in the dark. Yeah. I think ultimately we want to walk with people. So for the pastors and church leaders who listen, right, we've got all kinds of staff members in different roles. How can he or she you talk about creating that culture, but now we want to help the people in our church to walk through that. What are some ways that you would encourage to help them wander without being lost?
Yeah, good.
You just like that phrase.
I know. I'm a Tolkien fan. So let's see. So I would say, I'm convinced that the primary people who are going to do this ministry are probably not the pastors. It's going to be the parents. Right. And so I think you need to, of course, cultivate the culture for people just in general to come and ask their questions and so on. But I do think if a pastor were to really get intentional about this, it's going to need to kind of translate into ministry training for their parents, where parents are, again, I think they need a certain level of content, because there's just certain questions that get asked. I mean, the problem of evil.
And let me say too, so you don't have to. That's the second half of the book too. It goes through some of these questions like the problem of evil and more. But keep going. How do you help equip parents?
So I think equipping parents there's going to have to be some of that content, because there's just certain questions that are going to come up. I had a conversation with my son this week about dinosaurs and why we don't see those in the Bible. And for him, and he's 11, so he's not like fixated on dinosaurs like younger boys can kind of tend to be, but it was for him a bit, and then now he's sort of asking these questions, and I think taking seriously the 1 Peter 3:15 of being ready to be prepared, and that's the way I think I see the pastor's role most primarily, is to equip the parents to be able to sort of minister to the kids in this way and disciple their kids this way. But one of the things we've done series of apologetics. We've brought people in. I've helped with that at our church, and then we've also tried to sort of work it in, kind of come back to it periodically, so that as those times kind of circle back, they're able to sort of bring their questions and plug the holes that they had and so on, to equip them to be able to do it. But a big part of it is establishing the relationship with your kids too. I think, again, being sort of earning the right to speak into their life. That I think so I'm a Generation Xer. I'm Generation X. I'm kind of at the tail end of it, but
and I'm the other side of it. But we're both Gen X for the win.
For the win.
Yeah.
I think
nobody cares about us. Just for the record, nobody cares about Gen X. We're like, it's like totally irrelevant to the rest of people. But you and we're rejoicing in this slacker moment. But keep going.
I'll take it. But I think, as we tend to be bad as parents in some ways. Like the parenting trends are that we protect them from everything outside of the house. So they're, if our kid's going out, they're going to have a helmet on, on a bike or whatever. We're not going to let them do a bunch of stuff. We're going to be at every event that's going on outside of the home. But then inside the home, we just let them do whatever we want them to do. There's no protection, so screens and everything else is just sort of often tends to be no rules and so on. And so I think cultivating that relationship inside the home in order to earn the right to speak into their, speak and answer their questions, to be that sort of trusted person in their life that they would go to. So anyway, that's probably not a very succinct answer, but
no, I think it's helpful. I think
those
you're
are the
kind of
sorts of things that
you're walking through the field with us. And I think that's part of what we're trying to figure out. And I think a lot of people are trying to figure out, because they feel that, statistically, there's not this huge wave of deconstruction. The reality is most people who stop identifying as Christian were very nominally Christian. That's right. The one, maybe 2% a year, depending on the year. But the reality is there is, we can name names of people who've walked away. My colleague here at Wheaton, Michael Lee, wrote a 3,000 word article for Outreach Magazine. We'll put it in the show notes he did his PhD on the deconstruction, deconversion of Christian missionaries and pastors. Right. So this is very real. And I think social media has sort of elevated some of those voices. Some of them were prominent because of family connections, or prominent because of their own ministry. So that gets our attention. So what do you make of the people, particularly Christian leaders and influencers who've been deconstructing? How do you think, and how should we respond?
As concept, I like the idea of deconstructing. So I'm a little different than some of my
That's going to be the
colleagues.
Clip we're going to take out of this program and run it over and over again.
Some of my colleagues, have really kind of freaked out about it. And as concept, that's a lot of what I'm talking about, is asking those deep and difficult questions and really probing. And if we want to call that deconstruction, that's I'm not completely against that. The problem is that deconstruction is a negative concept, though. So it's really incomplete in a way, because nobody just deconstructs. They always then construct something in place of whatever they've sort of taken apart and thrown away. And that's what doesn't get talked about, because it's easy to say, I don't believe such and such, but it's much harder to say, I believe this, and here are my reasons why. And so what I want to know from, the various ones who have deconstructed is, what have you constructed in its place? It's kind of like I don't know if you get into the debates with atheists and Christians and so on.
I've watched a few.
Not always the most constructive situation, but anyway, atheists, there's a certain brand that will say, look, atheism is just the denial of theism, which in a technical sense, okay, maybe, right? And so but the reason to do that, it's sort of genius in one sense, because rhetorically they don't have to give any evidence for their view, because they're just saying, hey, I'm just not convinced. I don't think your evidence is any good. That's all atheism is. It's the denial of theism. But I think that short circuits our discussion in a way, because I want to say, well, okay, well, then what do you believe? And let's have a discussion about that. Like, there is a rhetorical burden for you to take here. And I think that the so-called deconstructionists sort of try to avoid that burden as well, to say, okay, well, then what do you believe about reality? Okay, if you don't believe that God exists, if you don't believe that Christianity is true, if you've sort of deconstructed those, let's hear about, right? Which again, it's okay to be on that journey, to ask those questions and to change your beliefs. I mean, I think we really need to do that. I think if, somebody from a different religious tradition came to us and said, hey, I'm asking questions about this, should I really press in? We would say, yes, of course you should. Doubt your faith, right? But we need to be consistent in that and say that we need to do the same thing too. But it's all for the effort of finding out what's true. It's all for the effort of finding out what we do in fact know. And so deconstruction is fine for what it is, but don't stay there. Like, we need to now focus on, what do we construct in place of whatever it is we've changed, if we've changed it all.
Yeah. So let's talk about how people should respond, or how, as pastors, church leaders, we would want to encourage them to respond. Again, a reminder, everyone, the book is Wandering Toward God, Finding Faith Amid Doubts and Big Questions. But I mean, the subtitle is Finding Faith Among Doubts and Big Questions. So what's the relationship between faith, doubt, and unbelief? And can we have certainty that Christianity actually is true and real?
Yeah. Just easy ones, right?
Yeah, just light topics.
So I make a big point in the book to say that faith and doubts, having faith and having some doubts is completely fine, is completely consistent. There's no sort of inconsistency there. And the reason why is because what faith is when we place trust in something. And you can, so long as you place trust in it, you do in fact have faith. You can do that with a little bit of wavering, with a little bit of uncertainty, with a little bit of question, and I think even some doubts. So I like to use the example of getting on an airplane. If I'm honest, I don't know a lot about how airplanes even work. And I could find myself in a place of questioning and doubting that 1 million pounds of metal should be able to lift off the ground and cruise at 6 miles off the planet. Like, that's kind of insane when we think about it. But insofar as I get on board the airplane, I am placing my faith in the airplane. And so I think a kind of beautiful picture of the Christian journey is, we can imagine somebody sitting on the airplane doubting that this should even be working, having all kinds of questions while flying, while being on the airplane. And so I think that's often where we're at, is that we come to Christ. We've got lots of questions. We've got lots of areas in which we need to sort of work it out still. But we can be on board while we're sort of still working it out. I think there's no problem with that.
We can be on board while we're still working it out. I think that's an important distinction, that not everybody is 100% convinced, maybe even while they're on that journey, and sometimes may wander through that. That's so right. Okay, so keep going.
Okay, so unbelief, though, I mean, that really is So I use a lot the great Os Guinness quote that doubt is not the opposite of faith, unbelief is.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. So like unbelief is right. When we have doubts, it sort of assumes that we still believe, because you wouldn't be doubting, you would just be in a place of unbelief. The what you're in fact doubting are the beliefs that you have. And so we're not, again, I don't want anybody to stay there though. That's why I'm trying to sort of navigate a path here between overemphasizing and over celebrating doubt, but also not ignoring it, because I think it's an important moment for us. But you mentioned certainty, and I want to talk about that because I think that
Please.
We do a real disservice to our kids and our people, talking to the pastors now in our churches, when we act like we've got it all figured out, when we act like we have 100% certainty about every matter of Christian doctrine and faith and practice. And the reason is because I think our kids think, well, I have to have certainty. And they sort of drum up this attitude, well, I've got certainty. I'm certain that it's true. And then they get into a college campus somewhere, somebody starts or a workplace setting, and somebody starts pressing them on some belief or some objection. All of a sudden, they don't have certainty, and the whole thing comes crashing down. It's oftentimes I've seen this with kids and just people in general that walk away from the faith given an objection that has a really good answer. There are whole books that have been written addressing that very question, but because that threw them into this place of uncertainty, they just sort of walked away because they thought faith must be a matter of certainty. So I have a whole chapter in the book on this that's called, if I remember right, "Certainty is a House of Cards."
It always amuses me when authors can't remember their books. I do the same thing, because you write it like a year before it's published. What's my chapter title?
Right. But it's
Walking Towards
House of Cards, which, right, I don't know who has the time on their hands to do these things, but if you see them, these, really large house of cards where somebody has balanced playing cards and constructed this whole thing, well, it's kind of by its very nature precarious, where you pull one card out, the whole thing comes crashing down. If our faith is, I think, aimed at certainty, then our faith might be a house of cards in that same sense, because one question, all it takes is one question, and that whole thing comes crashing down. Where what I say is that we need to aim at not certainty, but confidence, because confidence can tolerate some questions. Because again, as you said, and as I say all the time, that I've got some questions. I've got some things that I'm still working out. So I don't have absolute certainty sitting here, right now. And so if faith required certainty, I guess I don't have faith, right? But that's crazy. It's aimed for something like confidence. I am confident that Christianity is true, 100% confident. In fact, I've given my life to it. I've gotten on board again. Like I've given my all of who I am to it, because I'm confident in its truth, while I still am on the journey, sort of working out some questions as I go.
It's good. I love the endorsements on the back of your book, since they're almost all from Talbot, but that's another story for another day.
Right.
Because we I mean, this is a new role for me. We have a significant apologetics program.
Absolutely.
But I'm very enthusiastic about it, because I think as culture becomes more secular, apologetics becomes really a part of the mission. Just at a higher and higher level, people have questions. You got to kind of work through those questions as well. So what encouragement do you have for pastors and church leaders who are kind of walking through with people? Maybe, in your case, you grew up in a Christian home. I didn't. So my journey is obviously different, but my kids obviously did.
Yeah.
But somebody who's not a follower of Jesus, but is trying to walk through and think through. I just listened to a podcast where Molly Worthen, she's a professor at the University of North Carolina, who's written Apostles of Reason. I'm citing it in my book on a future of evangelicalism. And she just walked through her conversion. She's now a follower of Jesus, been baptized at Summit Church by J.D. Greear. And, here's this, tenured professor at the University of North Carolina. Fascinating journey. But clearly, she talks about in the podcast, Colin Hansen did the podcast, Gospel Coalition podcast. She talks about how they just walked with her, JD and actually Tim Keller. It's got to be nice if you have JD Greer and Tim Keller as your conversation partners on this journey.
Right.
But they kind of walk through those questions and spend time with her sharing that journey. So how should we do that? Should we say, hey, let's read this book and talk about it together? So put yourself in the pastor and church leader hat. Yeah. He or she is engaging somebody who's got questions and doubts, not yet a Christian, maybe not grown up in a Christian home. What do you encourage them to do?
So first of all, I want to again sort of encourage, and I say in the book that if you're somebody with doubts and questions and so on, and struggling with it in particular, then it's probably because you're more honest and courageous in a way than others, because you're willing to sort of look those problems in the face and so on. And so especially, so you said a non-Christian.
Yeah.
What I want to call,
who's got questions, who's doubting it, who's thinking through it.
So I want to say, I want to encourage that and just say how awesome that is, and talk about how important it is for that person to find the answers and to just keep going. So just a word of encouragement, I think, is always the sort of right posture with somebody who's seeking. I also want to say that they need to lean into those things, and they need to find their answers, and don't take pastor's word for it. Don't take, an author's word for it or whatever, but do avail themselves of those resources, because there are good answers. I mean, this is part of the Christian tradition, as long as there's been a Christian tradition, as you mentioned, perhaps really starting with the life of Jesus. I mean, Jesus
Sure.
is doing miracles for a reason. It's to give people reasons to believe, to give people evidence, if you like. And so, and then Paul with laying out the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15, and then naming names for eyewitnesses and so on, and saying, that's been, and all the way through with Augustine and all the way through his church history, that has been part of the Christian tradition and so on. And so lean into those things, and avail yourself of those resources. One of the things I think is really important for people who are struggling with doubts and questions is to not do it alone. Because there's a way in which, when we are struggling, we sort of isolate. We have this sort of tendency to do it alone. And I did alone, but just to be honest, I sort of did alone, though I didn't walk through it with people necessarily. I walked through it with books. So I really had to lean in, and I think that's important. So don't do it alone, do it in community. But also remember that our community, our Christian community, is large, and it's some people that are no longer with us are still very, very helpful because of the books that they wrote and the legacy that they've left. So yeah, I think that's what I'd say there, is just avail yourself of those things. And I think it's okay to press people. I think it's okay to press people when they say, this is what I'm thinking. This is kind of where I'm landing. I think it's very okay to press that answer. I mean, part of this for me too, is I get to teach philosophy here at Dallas Baptist University. And so, that's kind of my area of specialization. And so that's just kind of the air we breathe. That's just kind of the culture of the philosophical world, is to really press on questions. And I think there's a way to do it that's, mean and rude and, is likely to drive people away. But I think pressing them on those questions. And maybe the last thing I would say too is, again, coming back to this idea that Jesus says the greatest commandment, the most important thing, is to love God with all of our hearts, souls, and minds. Notice, I think, the books out there in the world, and I've had lots of these sort of interviews and podcasts and things that have been wonderful. One of the things, you kind of have a few things crystallized for you that I did emphasize in the book, but I'd probably, if I had it to do over again, I'd do it. I'd emphasize this even more, is the sort of posture that I recommend in asking these questions and seeking the Lord. If we take Matthew 22, 37 seriously, that we're supposed to love God with our minds, it's not a posture of a critic that we should ask these questions, right? Because if you have the posture of a critic or the posture of a skeptic where no answer will do, you're going to kind of continually be critical. And I've got friends that are like this, that I just think, we have discussions and we have conversations, but it just seems that literally no matter what I say, they're still critical. They're going to find ways to poke holes in it. And I think if we have that posture, we're very likely not to find the truth. Yeah. The posture that I think Jesus is recommending in a way is the posture of a lover, the posture of somebody who is really seeking and pursuing. So I always like to, kind of illustrate that with the couples that always form inevitably every semester. The freshman class comes and you have these couples that form, and it's the kind of thing where like the world could be on fire and they're just locked into each other and don't notice because they're just so in love or whatever. And what are they doing? Well, oftentimes they're just asking questions. They're pursuing that person. They're wanting to know them in a deep way. And I think that's the right sort of posture one should take as one seeks, is to seek it as someone who is a lover, or one who is really pursuing the truth, really pursuing to know that person. That's why I say it's not just a system or a belief that we're after, it's a person.
Travis, thanks for taking the time in the conversation. Yeah. I think it's an important conversation. Andrew McDonald he works here at the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. He's a guy who was part of the judging process, and we're super thankful as the general editor of Outreach Magazine. We're super thankful for Wandering Toward God, Finding Faith Amid Doubts and Big Questions, to be the Apologetics Book of the Year resource. Thanks to Travis for joining us.
You bet. Thanks so much, Ed. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Dr. Travis Dickinson. Be sure to check out his book, Wandering Toward God, Finding Faith Amid Doubts and Big Questions. You can learn more about Travis at TravisDickinson.com. Thanks again for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content for ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast. And again, if you found our conversation today helpful, we'd love for you to take a few moments, leave us a review. That'll help other ministry leaders find us and benefit from our content. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.
You've been listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. For more great interviews, as well as articles, videos, and free resources, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.